right, welcome into the first edition of the Kentucky Derby Radar Show on Past the Wire TV. I am Jim Gazzale alongside the Pick Six King himself, Jonathan Stettin. John, hopefully you had a good Thanksgiving yesterday, and we're looking forward to a positive weekend at the races.
We are. It's a little bit of an early start this year for actually still technically next year's Kentucky Derby Radar shows, but there's a lot to cover this year, and I thought it was a good idea to start early because what is this, pool 1 or pool 2 of the advanced wagers now?
It's a good question. Pool 2. Well, see, they start early and earlier.
Yeah. They said it's pool 2 already, and when I looked at the past performances, I was like, they've got some nice prospects on here. We might as well start talking about this now. So Here we are.
Yeah, I think there's at least some decent races within the last couple of weeks and month or so that we can dive into, and certainly some horses that are already getting some buzz. And like we said on that live show we did the other night, it's never really too early to start talking about the Kentucky Derby.
I agree.
All right, so let's dive right in. I know you sent me a list of horses that you wanted to talk about. So let's start with Nash, probably one of the horses that's gotten the most amount of buzz here over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, he made it to my radar early. Even before he had run, I had heard about him. That they had a horse they thought was special in the barn. I did see some of his workouts; they were impressive. I thought he was going to jog first time out, and it was an interesting debut spot because there was a Todd Pletcher horse in the race that had ran in a couple of stakes and ran okay. That also took a lot of money. He Nash went off shorter than he did, which I thought was a statement to how good and how much buzz there was and how good the workouts looked. Didn't win from the rail that day, but was a little bit green in my opinion. But when he stretched out, he really, really put it together. And for me, it was visually how he looked so within himself, not only when he was on the lead, and stretching out off that sprint, he figured to be on the lead that day, but it was when, they turned for home and he was clear and Flo had not even asked him yet, and then kind of just gave him a little bit of a cue. The way he accelerated really screamed racehorse to me. It was the kind of thing I like to see. And the fact that while he was on the lead early in the race, he was able to kind of shut down and relax and do it within himself, kind of signaled to my eye that he's a horse that can probably sit a trip, second, third, fourth, and, stalk another horse and go after him and still finish. We heard from Flo. So why don't we see what Flo had to say about him and how long they knew about
him? Breathing in the morning with some other maiden, you start, stacking them up with some of the better horses. And we're at the point where the competition was almost too easy for him. So we put him with some of the best 2-year-old, Brad has, and he was able to handle those guys very easily prior to his first race. Right. Unfortunately, I was not able to ride him that day because I was traveling to New York to ride Timberlake in the Champagne. Right. So Flavian, Flavian filled in for me, and I told him, I said, that's the one I really like. I'm just not sure about the distance. I remember there was 6 furlong and he drew the 1, and he always give me a feeling where he has a great mind, and I think the distance will be better for him. The added distance is also, I almost was sure he was going to route. And just the way he was doing it in the morning, just very easily composed. He took his time. He was not in a rush. So I was excited before his first race, and of course, when you run a few days ago, it just I thought he was going to run like this, but he ran faster than I thought he would. I thought he was going to win, but I was just wanting to see how, and it just blew my mind when I look at the clock stopping by. I barely asked the horse. He went 2 seconds faster than the other split of the race.
Right.
No, he's a horse with a beautiful pedigree, and we all know, those Godolphin horses, they have runners every single year. So
Right.
I'm hoping I got the one this year.
The two takeaways I get from that, well, there's a few. One is he said he was worried about the distance first time out. Usually a rider's worried about the distance when a horse is going to go long.
Right.
He wasn't. He was worried that was too short. So, even with that speed, there was no concern about the distance. And when you listen to Flo, I mean, he was outworking everybody. They had to put him with the better horses in Brad Cox's barn. That's saying something, because we know the kind of horses that are in that barn.
Yeah. That was going to be something that I was going to bring up. When you're looking at these Kentucky Derby future wagers, especially this far out, if you're thinking about making a bet in these pools, at least for me, it's so hard to feel super confident in picking a particular horse. So maybe you look at a trainer that is typically sending multiple horses to the Kentucky Derby, or at least pointing multiple horses to the Kentucky Derby. And we know for sure over the last handful of years that Brad Cox is certainly one of those trainers.
No question about it. You could take away other things from what Flo said, and I think he said a lot in a short period of time. He thought the horse would win despite there being a staked place horse already in the race as a maiden. He didn't seem to be concerned about anybody else. He surprised him with how fast he ran. He talked about how he thought he could route, and at this point, I think it's pretty tough to knock Nash at all, and find anything negative to say about him. I like the fact that he's a horse that's not already in the stakes ranks, didn't run in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. I'm more of the opinion that to get a horse to peak on the first Saturday in May, it's not so much having a great 2-year-old. You may have a great 2-year-old, but it's not so much winning the Breeders' Cup Juvenile or any of these stakes, but it's really letting a horse develop. And it looks like that that's what they're doing with Nash, that they're going to be patient and take their time with him. They didn't rush him at all to try and make any of these stakes. I don't know where we're going to see him next. We may not see him again till he's 3.
Yeah.
And that's fine, in my opinion.
Yeah. The other thing that you could kind of touched on a few minutes ago is the running style that in his last race suggested to you that he might even be able to, rate off of a horse and go around them and win. I guess that's one big sort of concern, or at least one thing to keep an eye on as we go through the rest of the winter and into the early spring here, is just the running styles of these horses. Very rarely are we seeing horses win the Kentucky Derby on the front end. They like to kind of sit in that second flight of horses, or maybe even a little bit, further back from that. But, we'll kind of see if these, race tactics for Nash change in any such way over his next couple of races, because you have to think, right, these trainers know what the running style of winning Kentucky Derby horses are, and they'll try and get their horses to to kind of follow suit here over the next couple of months as they train them up.
No question about it. And there's a tremendous edge out there now because they show most of these workouts, and you can watch them yourself. And a lot of times, and I think, we always talk about edges and advantages in making wagers. And the barns like Brad Cox, Todd Pletcher, Bob Baffert, Chad Brown, there's so many others that have that many good horses. Okay. It enables them to train them and school them in the morning. And we've watched this out at the, Breeders' Cup and some other events together that, the big barns, and I don't think anybody does it prettier than Aidan O'Brien, but, the way that they can school and train their horses to be behind horses, move outside, go past the other horse, then move outside, go past. I mean, when you've got a 5 or 6 horse stable or an 8 horse stable, you really don't have that luxury. And in those barns, not only do you have that luxury, but you have that luxury with a barn full of really good horses. So, come maiden special weight day, come these early stakes, where you're facing a lot of inexperienced 2-year-olds, why do these guys win so many? Yeah, they've got great horses and they're great trainers, but that's a built-in inherent edge, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. You hear people talking about, this trainer's horses always re-break at the top of the stretch, and a lot of times they've just been able to train that way to find that extra gear, with a quarter of a mile to go, an eighth of a mile to go, because they have other quality horses in the barn that they can train alongside. I mean, it's just like,
that's 100%
like humans.
Yeah.
So
100% accurate. And one of the things that people will miss, and I think it's a good takeaway, is, they'll look at a horse like Nash, and some others that we'll talk about, and they'll make that early premature assumption that, Nash is a speed horse and needs the lead to win. You're saying that off one race where he was the best and fastest horse in the race. It's kind of like, those same people say, you got to be on the lead to win after the first 2 races on Breeders' Cup. They go wire to wire, and both winners were the only speeds and in the favorite or second choice, and kind of were supposed to win. You can't say that about Nash yet. If you think Nash and some of the others we're going to talk about need the lead to win, you're way, way, way premature.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up the thing about the running styles. We're going to have to see how this progresses for him. You have your last race, you led all the way around and won, as opposed to the race prior where you were second all the way around and didn't win. So,
right,
on the surface, sure, it looks like that, but this horse is 2 races into his career. There's plenty of more action on the horizon for this horse. So certainly way too soon to make a definitive judgment on that.
No question about it. I agree. And people will tend to do that. And, while I'm not a fan of the advanced wager for a number of reasons, primarily the odds. Okay. I think the odds on all of these horses should be much higher if you're betting them this far out. Yeah. But if Nash is half as good as I think he might be, and as Florent Giroux, who is a big money rider, I mean, road gun runner, he knows when he's sitting on a Ferrari or not. When you see 20-1 on a horse like that, you know what I mean? Taking a flyer, and we're going to look at some that are even higher than that. Now, I don't know what this pool is going to close at, and we'll probably help knock Nash's price down a little bit with this show. Sorry for the Nash players, but you got to be early. But 20-1 going in the gate on a horse like Nash,
Yeah,
I can't say that's a bad wager, even this far out.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think too. Part of the strategy has got to be thinking, what am I getting price-wise today, as opposed to what you think, if all things go well, as opposed to what you think you'd get on Derby Day. And if in your mind you feel like you're getting a better price today, then you know, it might be worth a little bit of money behind it at this point, even though it is, you know, many months away. Let's take a look at the next one you had on the list here is Private Desire. What stuck out to you about this one?
Private Desire is a little bit sentimental. Okay. He's owned by Stephen Brunetti, who is the son of John Brunetti. That's the family that owned Hialeah Racetrack. Okay. Stephen is very courageously battling an illness right now. I'm not going to get into his personal business. It's not my place to do. But I just think that, sentimentally, to see him win, they lost their dad not too long ago. Hialeah, people don't realize this, but Hialeah at one time was like Saratoga is today. It was like the buzz track. It was where all the best horses went. It was where everybody wanted to win. It was a gorgeous, and still is a gorgeous facility. It's run down a little bit now, but to see them and him win a Derby would be just an unbelievable story, in my opinion. They've been in the game for a long time, owning, breeding. They own Red Oak Stable in Ocala. They've had their share of good horses, but they've never won the Derby. And to see them, come up with a Derby horse would be kind of special. And, here's a horse who just looks like a horse that has some development potential to him. You know what I mean? He run at Saratoga, which we know what a tough meet it is to win there, and ran okay. Come out of that race, improved, stretched out in a stake, kind of held his own again, and just looks to me like a horse that, may have a lot of upside that we don't really see yet. He's certainly in one of the barns that could come up with a lot of horses on the first Saturday in May. And I just thought he was, a little interesting horse that's completely under the radar. Pedigree wise, I'm a little concerned on the bottom. That it just doesn't scream distance, but we've seen horses without that really distance pedigree and without the dosage index that we used to rely so heavily on years ago, doing well in the Derby of late. So that's kind of changed. So I just thought he was a horse that, was worth a mention as one that's, definitely going to be under most people's radar, that might have a lot of upside in him.
Yeah. I mean, he's certainly in a good barn, like my Brad Cox point. Todd Pletcher sends more horses to the Kentucky Derby every year, seemingly than anybody else. So, another one that as they begin to hopefully stretch out in distance here, this is one that will be keeping tabs on as we move forward. The next one that you had on there was Stronghold. As I search for his PPs here, there he is. Hold on. There we go. What'd you like about this one?
Well, a couple of things. When you watch his races, okay, and this is something that you'll see more watching his replays than you will in the past performances, and I actually love that, because everybody sees the past performances and they see the wins and the this and that, but this is a horse that just really tries. He just he gives his all. I don't think that in his first race and in his last race, the Bob Hope, he had the right setup in order to win. And he caught an extremely fast horse who's not on the list. I guess Nysos is not on the list because they're keeping the Bob Baffert horses off the list for now, I'm imagining, until they move barns, which I think is completely ridiculous. I think they should, have those horses on the list and B options, assuming that they're going to change trainers, or who knows what's going to happen by then. I mean, that to me, that's just a joke, but it's a situation I think has been handled extremely poorly. But this is a ghost zapper. That he's out of a Jimmy Creed mare, but I think Jimmy Creed is underrated in what kind of horses he can produce and what kind of brood mares he can produce. So I just think this is a horse, to me, that tries every time, digs in every time. I think he does want to route a ground. He won the mile race. He didn't win the 2 sprints, although he ran good in both of them. And I think he caught a buzzsaw of a sprinter last time out that he really had no chance to beat, going 7/8 of a mile. But he still tried, and he got in the race, and he got in the fight. And I don't think that's what he wants to do at all. I think this horse wants to sit off a couple of horses, sit in that stalking spot, like you said, that second flight, and make a run. And I think he's got a lot of room to develop for a guy that gets a lot of credit on the turf, but not a lot of credit on the dirt. And I think if you can train, you can train. I don't really think it, you got people still call Chad Brown a grass trainer, and, he's got a Hall of Fame resume on the dirt alone. So I think this is a very dangerous, sneaky horse going forward that can absolutely improve and become a player in some of the bigger 3-year-old races as we move along.
Yes, especially being, probably based out west, right? And, everybody wants to look at, who Baffert has in his barn leading into the Kentucky Derby. But, unfortunately, Practical Move broke down ahead of the Breeders' Cup. But, that was a horse that won the Santa Anita Derby and was, I thought a fairly live chance going into the Kentucky Derby last year. So this might be one of those horses that kind of flies under the radar. And, if you're watching this show, you're backing him now, and you can kind of follow him all the way along. If you're not watching this show, this might be the type of horse that sneaks up on you a little bit too late in the on the Derby trail, and by that time you're not getting the best value or the best price that you might.
Another thing, good point. Another thing that I liked about him is I've seen him work in the morning, and he has caught my eye. And here's a horse who's going up against horses and barns that really crank up at 2. And Phil D'Amato's not really that kind of guy. He's more of a let him develop, let him come along at a different pace kind of guy. And here he's got a horse that's running with a Nisos who's ready to run off the screen right now. And he's getting in there and digging in and trying hard against a horse like that, when that horse is probably a lot further along than he is at this point in his career. And the Derby's run several months from now. So, this is one that just looks to me like can develop.
Yeah. Let's take a quick timeout, and we'll be back to talk about a handful of other options in the Kentucky Derby pool, future pool number 2.
Cup Classic. Vino Rosso has taken the lead, and it's a vintage performance by Vino Rosso.
All right, so the next horse that we're going to talk about here is Carbone, and what's interesting to me is his sire, Matoli. And, what do we remember about Matoli, right? Didn't he blow the doors off everybody in the Met Mile?
Yeah, he won the Met Mile, but he's thought of as a sprinter. But I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to talk about that. But go ahead.
Yeah. So that that's what stuck out to me. And, we got a couple others on this list that we'll get to too out of Mitole, which, that's interesting to me because, we remember Mitole as this great sprinter. So what beyond that, if anything, caught your attention when looking at Carbone here?
Well, a lot of things, but let's get the Mitole discussion out of the way as the sire, because he's not going to be a popular Kentucky Derby sire, and in that sire pool, he's probably high on the list because people are going to assume, because he was a sprinter, that he's going to throw a lot of sprinters. Okay, I disagree. I think Mitole has got phenomenal sire stamped all over him. Okay, if you go back to his sire, Escandrea was a Zayat Stables horse, I believe, trained by Todd Pletcher, who was an early favorite off. I don't remember if the Wood Memorial, but he won one of the major Kentucky Derby preps. He was one of the favorites heading into the Kentucky Derby. A lot of sharp people liked him. He was a distance horse, and he got hurt, didn't run in the Derby, and wound up throwing Mitole. So Mitole's got that Escandrea in him. So Mitole might have been a very fast sprinter, but the way I look at breeding, and I'm no quantitative genetics expert, but I see Mitole as a horse who can get distance horses and will get distance horses, despite the fact that he was primarily a sprinter and super, super fast. So I'm not really worried about the sire, and I think paired with the right mare, and we see a Street Sense mare, which is, run all day on the bottom. So I've got no concerns whatsoever about Mitole paired with the right mare getting a distance horse at all. None. Zero for me. So with that said, Carbone just is another race that you watch, and you just, if you've been watching races long enough, you just watch this race and you're looking at a racehorse. You're just looking at a horse that knows what he's doing already, wants to win, turn for home, and just said, yeah, I'm in front, but I'm not done by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just getting warmed up. And he just took off and flew away from those horses like he was in a different stratosphere. So Steve Asmussen is another guy overdue to win the Derby. Come real close with Epicenter. Didn't quite get there, but hasn't given up by any stretch of the imagination. And this is a horse that I think, just can be anything. Just really screamed top class stakes horse to me. Now, whether he is a sprinter or whether he'll get the route, I'm not as confident in him getting it as I was in Nash. But I did see a horse who was not speed crazy, just very, very fast and on the lead because he was just so much faster than everybody else, not because he had to be on the lead. So Carbone is definitely high on my list of top 2-year-olds.
Yeah, that Mitole sire, just caught my eye. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. And same thing with the horse right above him here in alphabetical order in Booth. Another one out of Mitole, also for Steve Asmussen. Started at the 6 furlongs. What about this one? Kind of jumped off the page or jumped off the screen during his maiden race.
Very, very, very similar to Carbone. And I felt that if I didn't put him on the list and put Carbone on the list, I was making a mistake because he was very similar. He's by Mitole out of I wouldn't say distance, but Sophie's Song, stakes winner, if memory serves, and Bellamy Road was another one that was on the Derby trail. I think might have even gone off the favorite in the Derby for Nick Zito after winning the Wood Memorial by like 20 lengths or something like that. Didn't fire in the Kentucky Derby, and literally, I mean, he won the Wood Memorial by something like 10, 20, 15 length, ridiculous amount. Didn't win the Derby, but obviously a router. So you've got that same kind of cross in the pedigree, and this is the horse that got away from Nash and beat Nash, I think, first time out. So you know, he can be anything too. I mean, he just looked to me like a horse that was just screaming, you know, hey, I'm touting myself. If you don't pay attention, shame on you. You know, he just really, you know, showed that he is a, you know, graded stakes horse, in my opinion, right out of the box.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too. That you know he did beat Nash that first time out. I'm just trying to find that running line here again. So Nash is a February foal, and Booth, I think, is a May foal. And I know we touched on this a little bit during our live show the other night. What do you make of that? I mean, obviously the younger horse by several months was able to, you know, beat the you know, we'll call him an older horse just for our purposes here, a couple months older, figuring might be a little bit more mature towards the end of his 2-year-old year. Does that play into anything for you at this point along the Derby trail, or are we splitting hairs trying to just find another random talking point that doesn't matter all that much in your opinion?
Both. I think we're splitting hairs a little bit, but I think it's worth it in this case because I think, you know, at some point that come into play, it can come into play. There are so many things that you know affect these horses when they're at this stage of their career. I get the sense that they've been, you know, very patient with Nash, although we know they've been working and progressively with better and better horses. You know, Steve has a tendency to really have his horses on go early on from you know the onset of their careers, and looks more for them to hold their form as opposed to you know bring them into it. So you know, it's two little bit of different styles of training there, I think. But yeah, I do look at that, and I do think it can come into play. And I think it'll be interesting to watch. And now that we're talking about it, and you know, really, I don't hear anybody else really talking about that particular angle. So it'll be fun to watch as we progress, you know, this year and next year, and you know, maybe we can even do a show, you know, where we spend some research and go back and look at over the past couple of years whether that's been a factor in the outcomes of some of these derbies or not. Because I do think it's an interesting enough angle to consider, and it would make sense that the earlier foals are a little bit more developed and have a little bit of maybe a hidden sneaky edge that people are not looking at yet.
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, when it's interesting to me to have that much of a gap. You know, May foals are pretty late.
Right.
So, you know, interesting for sure. And, you know, something that, you know, might be a little bit of an outside angle that people aren't exactly focused on down the line. And, you know, maybe we can keep that one in our back pocket. The next one that we'll talk about here is the Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner, Fierceness, for Todd Pletcher, Mike Rapoli, and, you know, really ran off the screen at Santa Anita last time out after, you know, what was mostly a dud effort in the Champagne. Perhaps he didn't like the slop that day at Aqueduct, and you know, was just ready and raring to go at the Breeders' Cup. Really impressive race, and after that race, I believe there was a quote from Mike Rapoli saying that he was talking to Todd before the race, and they said he could run off the screen and win by 10, or they wouldn't be surprised if he didn't run a step at all and was one of the last horses to finish. So they didn't really know what they were getting, and it seemed like the bettors didn't really know what they were going to get either, sending this horse off at 16-1. So obviously, once the winner of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, automatically becomes the quote unquote favorite for the Kentucky Derby. How do you?
And they hardly ever win it, but
yeah. I mean, we've seen a couple over the years, but you're right. What about this one is interesting to you moving forward, if anything? Do you think?
Well, the glaring knock on him is the fact that the Breeders' Cup Juvenile is not exactly a key race to winning the Kentucky Derby, and I think it's because you have to be so cranked and so ready to run big at that point in your 2-year-old career that it's hard to maintain that form and then regain that form and peak up for the first Saturday in May. But Fierceness was probably, I would go as far as to say, one of my biggest wagering mistakes on the Breeders' Cup this year, and I'll tell you why. That horse, if you remember, at Saratoga when he won in the mud or the slop, was touted through the roof. I mean, they were saying he was one of the best 2-year-olds in Cards Barn. He was all that and a bag of chips, and he came out there on a wet track, and he ran like it, okay? And everybody was like, wow, how great is this horse? And everybody jumped off his bandwagon when he ran that flop in back downstate on another wet track. Now, we know all wet tracks are not created equal, and I'd go as far as to say Saratoga mud and slop is different than anywhere in the country. It just plays different. You can like that off track and not like a lot of other off tracks. So what we saw right here is the first race of Fierceness on a fast track. And where did all that hype that we heard in Saratoga come from? Fierceness training and running in the morning on a fast track. So not using him and not considering him pretty strongly in the Breeders' Cup was in my opinion just a huge wagering mistake that I, and obviously at 16-1, many other people made.
Yeah,
because it was his first start over a fast racetrack, and it stood to reason that we would see why he had all that hype as a 2-year-old before that race on August 25th up at the Spa. So that all that said, what does that mean going forward for the Kentucky Derby? Honestly, absolutely nothing, because it's November and the Kentucky Derby is not until May. So we've got to see how this one develops. We know he's got the talent now. I think it's safe to say that we thought he had and were led to believe that he had in August. Okay. But he didn't just fool the bettors and me, and he fooled the connections. I mean, I remember out there with you one morning when Mike was out there and they were watching some of their horses train, and a couple of the 2-year-olds went by and they were talking about them, not Fierceness, right, and how much they liked some of their other 2-year-olds that were running, in this race and in a couple of the grass races. And, Fierceness never came up. So he kind of, became the forgotten horse and said, wait a minute, now I'm on a fast track. So he could be really, really good and really, really talented. But my question and my concern comes back to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Is this a horse that is peaking too soon, or is just a step ahead of the others development-wise? I'd rather look for a horse in an early pool, which is basically what we're talking about, that's developing and going to develop and has signs of development, as opposed to a horse who's, quote, already developed, and we have to hope has more in the tank or can maintain that level that he's already at. And very often we see these horses that are really good late in the 2-year-old year just not progress, and other horses catch up to them, and all of a sudden they went from, wow, he was so dominant, over there, and he's just not dominant anymore, and several horses come to mind in that category. It happens almost every year that we see horses that fall into that category. So that's my concern about a horse like Fierceness, who I would imagine goes off what I would consider a shorter than should be price in pool 2.
Oh yeah, 15-1 if you get that. I'd imagine, coming off the Breeders' Cup win, that price might even drop a little bit. Still
Right.
way too short of a price to take this far out.
I agree.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point too about his first fast track. How do you handicap that, because you never saw it, right? So you don't really have any body of work to make an informed decision off of. Or you just thinking, okay, this is a Todd Pletcher micropole horse, first time on a fast track, let's just take a flyer because it's 16-1, and that's a ridiculous price for that pairing? Or do you do like what you did and just kind of stay away because there's not much to go on, and you don't have that strong of an opinion?
I made a mistake. I liked Muth a lot in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile this year, and that kind of clouded my judgment, I think. But I knew after a quarter of a mile I was in a lot of trouble and made a mistake, because I immediately saw how Fierceness was going, and I said, this is why that horse was touted at Saratoga that way. And where I'm in big trouble with Muth. I hope you're good enough, because this horse is going to run a race. And the whole way around, I was watching Fierceness. And when they turned for home and Muth kind of pulled up alongside him, I even still, I never had any confidence. I said, I hope you're good, because I know this horse is going to fight back. And honestly, Muth couldn't warm him up. He just said bye-bye and pulled away. And I just said, that was the mistake. That was the race that everybody was touting at Saratoga when he won in the mud, and the tell was there. The tell, with him, I could say the tell was there because of how highly regarded he was before that race in Saratoga, and I just missed it because of that flop he ran in the next race, and because I just got caught up in Muth and thought Muth, even if he was okay, Fierceness, Muth was probably going to be better. But I knew early on in that race, watching that race, I knew I was in trouble.
Yeah.
Fierceness.
Yeah, it's a good point to say this is a game that you can't really be a kind of like a casual observer or a passive sort of player. You've got to follow these horses for months and months and months, and kind of rely on, like you always said, your own eyes to kind of make heads or tails and read between the lines of these PPs. How many people are thinking about looking back to Saratoga to find an angle to get yourself to the Breeders' Cup? Most people, I would say, and I'm guilty of it, would look at that running line for Fierceness and say, well, we don't have a body of work here over a fast track, so just an automatic toss. I think most people would default that way. And what you're saying is, we got to think a little bit clearer slow ourselves down and really dive in there and see, because we could potentially find a horse at 15, 16, 17, 18 to 1 in a big race like that, and turn what would be a losing day into a positive day.
100%. Most people in horse racing bring a knife to a gunfight, and that's why so few are successful at beating the game and just making those big, 6-figure scores a couple of times a year. You've gotta do your homework. You've got to look for edges and things that are not ready to jump out, and Fierceness is a perfect example of that. And even you could be a savvy old pro, like a lot of people would consider me, and still mess up. But it's always good to go back. Like, I didn't have to go back. I knew a quarter of a mile into the race exactly what I did wrong, and that I was in trouble, and I was just hoping I was going to get away with it and not pay for it, and I didn't. But even as a seasoned veteran, you can make a mistake. But when you go back and even after the race, I can't get there. That's one thing. But when you go back, you should never be in a position like I was with Fierceness, where you go back and you're like, oh man, I beat myself. The tell was there. I mean, the tell to use that horse was absolutely there. Especially in a 2-year-old race where you're dealing with a lot of inexperienced horses, and like you said, there was no reason to like him on a fast track. There was no reason not to either. The reason to like him was the way he was working at Saratoga on a fast track that had the whole Adirondack region buzzing that this horse was a monster.
Yes.
Those works weren't all in the slop.
Right.
So it was there. You just had to kind of dig a little deeper than the past performances for it, and that's what you want to do, and that's what I think we're trying to do on this show, talking about horses like Carbone and Booth. That they were impressive winners. Nash is on the radar now, but those were impressive winners. But I mean, they're 50 and 90 to 1 going into this pool. So there's a lot of horses with stake experience that are going to be a lot higher on a lot of people's lists than those horses.
Yeah. Let's take one more quick timeout. We'll come back. We'll talk about Locked, and then we'll wrap up episode 1 of the Kentucky Derby Radar Show. All right, let's take a look at Locked, a horse that I feel like we've heard a fair bit about. He went off favored in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, which I guess was a little bit surprising to me, but he finished a well-beaten third. Really, not that anybody really threatened Fierceness that day, but what about this one is intriguing to you?
Well, he looks to me like a horse. First off, he's a gun runner. We know that the gun runners have been performing extremely well. I like the fact that he looks like a horse who is not the typical, but rather the atypical Todd horse, where he looks like a horse who's not ultra cranked up right out of the box. Looks like a horse who's developing, closed in his first race at Saratoga like he wasn't really a sprinter and wasn't really cranked up to win. Stretched out at Saratoga at that awkward mile distance where the times are always slow, and ran a nice race and won, and was able to come out of that and win the Breeders' Futurity, a true 2-turn race. at Keeneland, where with that short stretch, at that configuration, it's a little tough to get up from as far back as he was in that short stretch race at Keeneland. So that kind of put him on my radar a little bit, that he was able to do that. The Breeders' Cup Juvenile really didn't set up well for him at all. But to go back to what we were talking about, he was one of the horses that when they were out in the morning, that Todd and Mike were like looking at and like kind of in awe of how good he looked, and how good they expected him to run. They had definitely had their eyes on him a lot more than Fierceness, and he is not even one of Mike's horses. So he just looks like a horse that's developing the right way, and a horse that will have the right style to be getting into the picture late, come the first Saturday in May, if he continues to develop this way. And I like I said, I like horses that are developing and haven't peaked, and we haven't seen their best. And we haven't seen his best, I think. And I think the tell with him, when we go back and look, if he loses a prep or two, but still has enough points to get into the Derby, which he probably will because of the Breeders' Futurity win and the third in the Juvenile. So he really doesn't have to win any of the preps, and is going to wind up in as one of those, extra Todd Pletcher horses that's in the race, right? And he's the kind of horse that, come Derby day, that when he wins, I can go back and tell you, when he won that Breeders' Futurity at Keeneland and got up with that short stretch, that kind of told me that this horse had some talent, because that's not the easiest thing to do. So there's my tell with him, that he's a horse that can jump up and surprise everybody. And he might be a horse, like I said, that doesn't win any of the preps because he doesn't have to, still gets into the race because he's been, hitting the board, and then puts it all together when it counts, and gets the trip, gets the pace, gets everything go his way on the first Saturday in May, and bang, here's Todd Pletcher, and if Jose's still on him, but here's Todd and whoever winning the Derby at 20 or 30 to 1 on a horse that everybody forgot about or overlooked.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting sort of dynamic. I think as we get closer to the Kentucky Derby, the final two preps, kind of tell you a lot of what you need to know, but perhaps looking back at these races that are on the page right here might give you a little bit of an added edge, as opposed to somebody that's not going to take the time and look all the way back. It'll be interesting to see how this one progresses. Like I said, off the top here, I was kind of surprised that this horse went off favored, with all the buzz that Muth was getting, being out in California. I figured, that horse would have took the most money. So
I'm glad you mentioned that. That's an astute observation. This horse went off favorite over Muth in Muth's home, on his home court. So this guy was, thought of well enough by a lot of people, and enough people to move that Breeders' Cup pool to favoritism for him. So that would be, if this horse happens to win the Derby without winning any of the preps, like I said, that to me would be, there was the second tell.
Yeah.
Of course, went off favorite in the Breeders' Cup against Muth in Muth's home court. So what did that tell us? It told us he can run. You know what I mean? So we got two things here that tell us Locked can probably run. One, he was able to overcome that, Keeneland scenario, and two, he took all the, he took the money over Muth in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, which I was happy about because I liked Muth a lot better than him, and I'm like, this is definitely helping me. But neither one was good enough to beat Fierceness, as we discussed.
The sire gun runner here, we know gun runner's prowess on the racetrack, especially in his 4-year-old season. He's thrown a lot of stakes winners along with Justify in the last year. What do you make of this next year now? Do you expect Gunrunner to still have that level of stakes winners coming out of his pedigree? Do you expect it to drop off? Is there anything to be gleaned from Gunrunner as we get into as these 2-year-olds become 3-year-olds moving forward that might steer us towards his horses or even pull us away in your opinion?
Well, there's so much that goes into that, and so much of it is marketing, connections, and handshakes amongst the blue bloods of Lexington, for lack of a better term. When they've got a stallion they want to they make sure he gets the right mares that first year, so they could raise the price and move forward and whatnot. And the commercial breeding business is a fascinating business. So with Gunrunner, I tend to think he got some really good mares paired up to him, and they wanted to make him a great sire. He certainly delivered, and I think when you deliver like that, you'll get those good mares without the handshake and without the favors. So I think that Gunrunner is an excellent sire, is going to continue to be an excellent sire. Candy Ride, who he was by, never lost a race, short career, but was immensely talented. Gunrunner was like a war horse, throwback to some of our older type horses, just really, really good. And he was an awfully good 3-year-old too. Not as good at 4. And just a monstrous racer. So I think Gunrunner is gonna stay and be a good sire for years to come. Definitely a horse I would love to breed to.
Yeah,
if I was in the breeding business or had a mare. But yeah, he'd be one of my, real close to the top of my list.
Yeah, I agree. It's he's done a good job so far, and it would be cool to see a horse like that wasn't able to win any of the 3-year-old classics because he ran into American Pharoah, right? That
was it American Pharoah he ran into?
Justify?
Yeah, Justify. I think.
Justify.
And I think he ran third. He ran third in the Derby.
Yeah.
He run. It's funny. There's a couple of horses that are great horses in history that I think the best races they ever ran, they lost.
Yeah.
Okay. And Gunrunner's one of them. Zenyatta's one. I think the best race she ever ran was the second she ran to Blame. I think that was just an unbelievable race. I think Seattle Slew's Jockey Club Gold Cup in 82 or 83, when he went 22, 45, 109 and change, head and head with Affirmed, the Triple Crown winner. Got passed by Excella, who came up the rail and opened up 5 lengths, come back again to lose by a neck, gets up the next jump. Best race Seattle Slew ever ran, in my opinion, maybe any racehorse. Lost. Gunrunner's Dubai World Cup. Arrogate got all the hype. Okay, got every, and take nothing away from him. Arrogate ran a monster race, but if you go back and look at the charts of that night, okay, it rained like torrentially the night before the Dubai World Cup. Okay, and that, I think, even that day. So it was a very muddy, heavy track, drying out. Everybody came from far off the pace. Arrogate walked out of the gate, came from far off the pace. Gunrunner was on the lead. Nobody else on the lead stuck around that entire night. Everybody came from off the pace. Gunrunner ran second to Arrogate, who at that time was an absolute monster. So I always thought that was probably one of his best races, and he didn't win it, Yeah. So Gunrunner was a phenomenal racehorse.
Yeah, it's, you always like when those horses don't retire, after
Right.
the Triple Crown. Obviously not as well. I don't know. I mean, I've always had a fandom for Frosted, who came back in his 4-year-old season and won the Met Mile, won the Whitney, and both super impressively. So it'll be interesting to see, kind of tying this back to the Kentucky Derby future pool and these, still baby horses at rounding out their 2-year-old years. Hopefully we get a long time with them.
I agree. That's it's one of the many problems that the industry has right now, is that we're really racing to breed as opposed to breeding to race, and these horses get put away too soon. I mean, we talked about on our first live show Ace Impact. I mean, he got 4 or 5 starts? He might be the best grass horse I've seen in 20, 30 years. I mean, the horse came home faster than anybody in the ARC that I can remember, with that wide trip and all. I mean, what a loss not to see that horse be able to face Equinox and some of the others, man. I would have loved to have seen him at the Breeders' Cup against a horse like August Rodin, who won the English Derby, the Irish Derby, and the Breeders' Cup turf as a 3-year-old. I mean, that's unheard of, Equinox. So we've got all these great horses. Some of them stay around. August Rodin, I think, is going to run next year. White Barrio won the Classic. Looks like he's sticking around now, and he, since the Whitney, certainly looks like a different horse than he looked to be earlier in his career. So, yeah, I wish we had more of them.
Yeah,
I really do.
Yeah, and you touched on that Gunrunner Dubai World Cup with Florent Giroux on your interview from last week. So go check that out on the Past the Wire YouTube page. He talks a little bit more about Nash in there, so a little bit more helpful information to piggyback off of what we discussed here over the last hour or so.
One last takeaway, because you mentioned Frosted. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a big replay watcher. Okay. For those of you that want to get better at watching replays and learning how to watch replays, it's an art. Jim mentioned Frosted, and he liked that he stayed around to run at 4, and he ran a monstrous Met Mile at 4. Go back and watch Frosted's Kentucky Derby, and the next Derby Radar show, let's talk about them, or somebody put in the comments here what you think of Frosted's Kentucky Derby and his trip in the Kentucky Derby, and whether or not with a different trip we might have had a different Derby winner that year. So I would be interesting to see what a lot of people say about that.
Yeah. All right, we'll leave it there. We covered a lot of ground, I think, going through Kentucky Derby Future Pool number 2. Good luck if you're playing. Hopefully you've bolstered some opinions based off of what John and I had to say here over the last 60 minutes or so.
It'll be interesting to see if we have the Derby winner mentioned on this show. And the one disclaimer is we didn't talk about any Bob's horses because they didn't put them on the list. So they're I guess, under the all other category at 4 to 5. So next show, we're going to have to talk about some of his, because he's got a bunch of contenders, and whether they run or not, we don't know. So we'll see.
All right. Thanks, John.
Thanks. Everybody, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back.
Nobody does it better.